Does he have my sleeping was irregular, you think? I said, was it a weaning thing or cold turkey? Headaches? He goes, the first day was pretty
I do that every couple of years. I go just like a nut, and I'm off it for about 6 months, and then I like the taste. So I start drinking it again, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, 2 pots is gone again. Weird.
Man, I drink caffeine and I start shaking like a chihuahua trying to pass a beach.
So it's different from normal.
Man,
Do a lot of
Well,
love.
this is a rough
Man.
group.
I'm
I'm glad you're not
gonna go slightly.
I'm gonna go home.
Yeah, there you go.
Hello.
Hi, Jennifer. I think we're waiting for maybe a couple more. So.
All of a sudden, it's getting quiet.
Well, they said recording in progress, and it went.
That's it.
I mean, not that I care, but some people do. I'm better behaved when I be in person. Mhm.
I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I owe you that. I know I do.
I meant to use my stage whisper. Thank you, Carolyn, for your response.
I saw the email.
Okay.
All right, go ahead and start the meeting at 6:02. Thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Appreciate your time.
Okay. Well, yes, again,
That is.
oh, that's August. Yeah. We'll slow just a little bit. We have one more planning commissioner walking in. But this is Jennifer Bleicher with the Bleicher Institute or Bleicher Training. And she is here to present some information for us and some training, and it is in line with what we discussed for our strategic plan. It's mostly around consent building. We've had some contentious issues come up, and some things have been challenging to deal with. And so this is hopefully a tool to help us get through some of those more challenging meetings.
Liana, just let me know when it's ready to get started.
Okay, I think we're ready to get started.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for making time for me to join you this evening. I know this is a special session, and I apologize. I'm getting over a cold, and that's why I definitely didn't want to reschedule, considering you've all aligned your schedules to be here this evening. Again, my name's Jennifer, and we have been studying for over 40 years what highly effective people do. It's something my parents, Hans and Anna Marie, stumbled into. And it would be way too, I would do you a major disservice if I tried to cram it into one little presentation. So we're just going to share with you what we've noticed. We created a little special presentation just for you. And hopefully you have a copy of the handout. Liana and I did a little test run earlier this afternoon to make sure everything's working. Hopefully it'll work fine again this evening. If at any time you have a question, a comment, a protest, whether it's from you or the public, please interrupt me. I'm happy to stop hear your thoughts, your questions, and we can just answer whatever you need. Any questions ahead of the little video? And again, forgive me for my voice. I'm sorry, it's so scratchy. Okay, well, it looks like I don't have sharing capacity.
Oh, right, I forgot to do that.
That's okay.
Everything else.
Oh, good.
Just a little
Yeah, we
sharing
did
again.
have a little hiccup.
Yeah, okay, there we go.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so again, this is not, we're not really teaching you our approach, but it's something that it sounds like your staff is looking at. And our area of work is specifically to people, for teams, policymakers, decision makers, who have to figure out, have we really heard from the public? Because just like in a team, in a family, how groups make decisions is pretty complex. And when you talk about a community, even of your community size, or a county, or a special district, or a state, or a nation, or a province, it gets even trickier. So it's understandable if it feels like, how do we move ahead when there's serious opposition? So again, this is just sort of an overview of one aspect, one way of explaining our work. Okay, thank you for hanging in with me for a moment while I get the video set up for you. And I'll be muting myself. But again, if you have any questions, protests, comments, I'm happy to stop. We're going to watch just about a 10-minute segment. Then I'll pause and check in how you're doing. And then we'll watch a second video that's about 18 minutes, which leaves us a fair amount of time for any Q&A you have. So thank you.
I'm Hans Bleicher. I and my wife Anna Marie, and as of about 20 years ago, our daughter Jennifer, we have worked on how to make government work better, more effectively. You all probably work in some level of government, local, state, federal, special district. And the way these agencies like yours start, it's always the same way. The public identifies problems X, Y, and Z. They decide these are problems, they're not being addressed. They feel they ought to be addressed. And they look around, do we have an existing agency that has a mission that sort of broadly covers this area? If they do find such an agency, they designate that agency and give them the responsibility to solve these particular new problems or newly identified problems. And if they don't have an agency, they create a new agency. That's how we, as publics, create new agencies via our political decision makers who come out of the public. I have been doing research, not just on public sector problem solving, but on complex public sector problem solving. And I have to tell you, I find it amazing that an entity as complicated as the public, that they can do anything, such as create a new agency, give a new agency a mission, because the public is a crazy kind of thing. It's made up out of a whole bunch of nothing but special interests. Some of them are individuals, some of them are groups, some of them are corporations, for profit and not for profit. Some of them are institutions, some of them are other agencies. And they each have their own likes, dislikes, hopes, dreams, fears, prejudices, agendas. To show you how crazy this is, some of these members of the public are members of several interests. They may be a member of a homeowners association, but they're also a member of a union, and they are happen to be elected to an office, and they have a right to speak up through that mechanism as part of a special interest. So don't confuse the public with a bunch of individuals. Yes, it includes individuals, but also groups, organizations, entities, other agencies, corporations, you name it. Another thing that's crazy about the public, they can do anything. They can distort the truth. They can outright lie. They can play dirty. They can cheat. It doesn't mean that it's nice or that it's really approved. But we, the public, let our members of the public get away with it. We might criticize them for it. And the reason that's important, you who work in a public agency, we won't let you get away with any of that. You cannot play dirty. Not even against people who do play dirty. You cannot twist the truth. You cannot hide information. You cannot have secrets except under very, very special circumstances. So not only do you work as a public sector professional, you have chosen to work in a crazy environment, in a totally uneven environment, where you are restricted by what you can do and how you can play. And the other players in the game, they're a bunch of loose cannons. They can get away with almost anything. Now, you shouldn't be surprised that it is difficult to get things done under those circumstances, which is why you might have found it difficult if you have spent 20, 30, 40 years in the public sector to get things done. It's not an accident. It's an almost impossible setup. Mind you, this is not a sign that things are broken. No. That's the way it is, the way it has been, the way we, the public, insist on having it. We insist on that system. So don't blame somebody else. We're part of the problem. There are some cultural differences. There are societies and cultures, and sometimes that coincides with countries, where even the public, those special interests, are expected to play by pretty much the same rules that you have to play by. But not in the US. No, here. I don't fully understand why. I understand some of the background historically for that, but it is pretty crazy. The agencies that we as publics create, they generally have a group of decision makers who again are politically elected or appointed by the public. Or sometimes some in-between agency gets to do that. And we have a team of subject matter experts, the staff, the technical staff. It's the decision makers who are appointed or elected who hire a staff. The decision makers is a very small group. The staff can be very large. And they either are staff that are hired by the agency as employees or as consultants. Either way, they need experts in there. These subject matter experts, I also call them SMEs, they do rigorous analysis of the problems they're responsible for solving. And they each one develop their own or adopt their own problem-solving process that is rigorous and thorough and appropriate for the problem at hand. And most of these processes are not unlike the one we often use, just as an example, what we call the 16-step minimum ingredients of reasonably thorough problem solving. The subject matter experts use their problem-solving process to analyze what the problem is, how best to address it, what possible solutions are, etc. And then they recommend a course of action to the decision makers. The subject matter experts do not get to make decisions, they get to give advice to the decision makers. And even though the decision makers in the agency are not experts, they get to choose which option to implement, whether to implement anything. They get to make the decisions. Now, while the technical experts give advice, it has to be facts-based advice because it's facts-based analysis. That's not true for the decision makers. The decision makers can and probably need to take into account how the public feels and how the various interests feel in there, which is why they are appointed from the public in the first place. So they are not limited to the same strictly facts-based. They can include attitudes and preferences, and they do. In fact, that's why they are appointed from different points of view and different kinds of biases and priorities. While most of the effort, the work that the subject matter experts do, 90% of it, goes into that technical analysis, that 16-step process, about 10% of it goes into communicating with the public, with outreach, making sure that the public is reasonably informed about what the experts are looking at, what they're thinking, what they're developing, and also so the experts learn what the concerns of the public is and of their various interests, not in order to please them, just so that they are not ignorant about what concerns them, what their issues are. Because all these different interests have different issues. While projecting and predicting what the impacts will be on different interests is part of their technical analysis. If they don't do that, that is sloppy work. How people will receive that and how they interpret that and how they perceive that, that is not strictly scientific or technical. Because again, that depends partly on people's attitudes and biases, and often they are misinformed. And so they react based on that, on misinformation. The experts need to become aware of that so they can reasonably communicate with people who are misinformed and make sure they're reasonably informed. In other words, if there are interests out there who are badly informed, poorly informed, or misinformed, or disinformed, that's a technical failure. The technical experts need to be aware of that and see what they can do about that. So creating a reasonably informed public is no small challenge. But again, it's relatively small work compared to their technical analysis on the typical large project.
Okay, I just want to pause there and also note a couple of things Hans didn't say. We're not just talking about people who are misinformed or are using some underhanded method to get away with their personal agenda. Often it's informed people. Sometimes it's someone who even has expertise. If your community, your team of subject matter experts are working on a project, and maybe it's a retired engineer who says, oh, you know, I found how technically unsound your work is. So the problem can be a variety of things, whether it's a misinformed public or it is an informed public, but they feel like you're addressing something that is not a problem, or they feel like you're not the right entity to be solving the problem, or it's a problem, but it's not a problem considering all the other problems that team of subject matter experts could be addressing. Or maybe they feel like the process isn't fair. So when we talk with people who are experiencing a lot of controversy when it comes to the work their community, their subject matter experts or public servants are doing, and we hear things like people are saying, this is a violation of my property rights. We understand essentially what the issue is. That's not the same necessarily as somebody who thinks it's not a problem. that sounds like it's probably somebody who has concluded your process isn't fair, or the whole thing seems to be cloaked as some hidden agenda. So it's a bigger legitimacy, credibility issue. So I just wanted to pause there and say a couple of things that he didn't say. Any questions, comments, protests so far? Okay, well, I don't want to delay your evening, so let's get on with the second video. And there we share a bit more of the meat of what we have discovered sort of accidentally. One second, sorry about that. Just want to make sure the settings are
As
right.
an undergraduate, I studied architecture. And towards the end of my architecture studies, I became very interested in
Sorry about that.
how designers, how art. As an undergraduate, I studied architecture. And towards the end of my architecture
Studies, I became very interested in how designers, how architects came up with designs, with solutions, because you're given a situation and you have to design something. And so I became very interested in the creative process, the design process, the problem-solving process. And when I decided to go on to graduate school, I made it my graduate research to study how does a team of subject matter experts who works for the public manage its problem-solving process, given this complex public and political decision makers and the need to communicate, to look at this whole process. And I did several years of research on that kind of thing. And I started with doing 4 large case studies, actual cases, one in New York, one in New Jersey, one in Boston, and one in Los Angeles, on where you had large teams addressing big complex design problems and interacting with complicated publics. I came away with 2 major findings from that research, which changed my life. That wasn't the intention, I was just interested. Let me share these findings quickly with you. Finding 1 was sort of a shocking wake-up call. I found that with these very sophisticated agencies, and they were representative of other sophisticated agencies, they were very ineffective. They did very good technical analysis. They did very thorough processes. They put many person years into these analyses, came up with which were darn good solutions and recommendations, and nothing happened. Those recommendations would get tabled, would get stalled, would get watered down. Not all of them, but a high percentage. And sometimes the project would already get in trouble towards the end of the process. By the time they were in steps 7, 8, 9, 10, it already slowed down. And so the finding 1 was that far too many products of good, rigorous, legitimate problem-solving efforts failed to be implemented. They can't get implemented and they can't get funded. You have to get both. You have to get the political decisions made that yes, we're going to do this, and the decision made that yes, we're going to fund it. And if you can't get those two, well, that's... Well, I intended to become a public official and do that kind of thing, at least for a few years before I could go into academia. And that was sort of a shocking wake-up call. Finding two was a very different thing. It was a total surprise. I found that here and there was a team of subject matter experts, or a particular subject matter expert, or a particular manager of a team who never got stopped, never got torpedoed. All of their stuff got implemented promptly, as if there was nothing to it. Even though they worked on the same kind of projects, with the same kind of public, the same kind of crazy politics. We called these people, these rare here and there people, implementation geniuses, because they sure looked like geniuses. They probably weren't geniuses, but they could do almost, they could take a belly-up project, a project that was in deep trouble and was about to be killed, and an implementation geniuses would happen to be transferred as a project manager, and the project would just get implemented like that. Breathtaking. It was like watching somebody walk on water. That was finding two. The obvious question that we asked, what the heck are they doing differently? What was these so-called implementation geniuses doing differently? They're not necessarily smarter or better. There just was no obvious reason why they should be. Because most of these people were admirable people, even the ones who failed over and over and over. Dedicated to their jobs, good at it. Well, looking at what implementation geniuses do, when 90% of their work goes into that technical analysis, scientific analysis, that 16-step process, and maybe 10%, we call it the right-hand process. From your point of view, it's the right-hand process, is the outreach, the interaction with the public. They did this part the same as everybody else. They did this part, the outreach, fundamentally different from what most managers did. What was the fundamental difference? It was this. What most people did, and it's natural, they used outreach to try to drum up more support for what they were wound up proposing. Implementation geniuses did not do that. Oh, they're not against support. They like support. But they didn't really work at it. What they would lose sleep over from day one on when they worked on a project is they would ask themselves, whom are we going to wind up hurting? Who is going to just have to be against us by the time we're done? Which individual, which group, which corporation? And purposely say, they didn't really do a lot of outreach. It was mostly thinking. They were mostly thinking, who is just going to have to oppose it? Because we are going to maybe bankrupt them, or we're going to have negative impacts. There's no way they can support what we're going to do, and yet it's what we're going to do is the right thing to do. And they would try to get into their heads. How are they feeling? How are they thinking? And what they would try to do, but they would do a lot of thinking before they would actually lift a finger, is they would try to reach out to them, try to understand them, make them realize that they, the bureaucrats, the professionals, were concerned about the negative impact they were likely to have. They would literally try to go to them before they could even think of it and say, we hate to tell you, but we're going to probably have to propose something that is going to be very negative for you. Please work with us. We're not asking you to support what we're doing. There's no way you can do that. What we're going to ask you to do, can you live with it? Because we're doing our level best. We're doing all we can to minimize the impacts on you, but we are not willing to forsake our responsibility, our mission. The mission is not negotiable, but we will try to achieve it in a way where we harm you no more than is absolutely unavoidable. And if that interest comes to that conclusion, they're likely to consent to go along. Now, don't confuse consensus and consent. Consent is not agreement. Consent is the grudging willingness to go along with something that you're really against. So what these implementation geniuses were doing, they were systematically developing their opponents, their fiercest opponents, informed consent. Where those opponents would literally come to the conclusion, if I had this official's job, and they have a legitimate job, an important job, they're addressing an important problem that really has to be addressed, and if I had that job, I would have to recommend something pretty much like what he or she is recommending. And at that point, that person is likely to conclude that the right thing for them is to go along. And when you get your fiercest opponents to go along, and they usually even explain to the public, they will explain, I'm not really in support of this, but I can live with it. I've decided it's the right thing to do. Wow. People will take their hat off to those public officials. And they will say, did you hear that? Do you know who that is? That is a person who has always been against this agency. And they're saying, in this case, they can live with what the agency is proposing. So they become very good consent builders. And once we discovered that, we spent decades as the small organization that we are, Anna-Marie, I, and Jennifer, of trying to communicate to elected officials, appointed officials, all their staffs, what consent is, and that it just changes everything. If you can develop consent, and if you are doing rigorous work, you're not shortchanging any of those 16 steps, and you are addressing a legitimate problem in the first place, and you are a legitimate agency in the first place, consent is perfectly possible. And once you can internalize that in your organization, nobody's going to badmouth your government organizations. So one of our sort of hidden agendas, our little team, is to make government more effective by training folks like you and your staff and your colleagues in the systematic development of informed consent. Now, systematic means you do it on everything. On big projects, little projects, quick and dirty projects, the long, drawn-out, multi-year studies. On all of it. Within the time limits and constraints that you have. Consent building does not take a lot of resources. It does not. Most of the implementation geniuses that we watch and we have observed probably do less public outreach than the average typical agency that then gets torpedoed and gets badmouthed and hated. Government agencies don't get respect and admiration for how much outreach they do. They get it for the problems they address and the compassion they have for the people whom they're affecting negatively, impacting negatively. That's what they get it for. And that takes more courage than time or money. One reason I mentioned that it takes courage is a lot of folks who hear about systematic development of informed consent think, oh, that sounds like a neat gimmick. If we could incorporate that gimmick and then people would have respect for us, I hate to tell you, it's not a gimmick. I know of no gimmicks that are helpful. What's helpful is brutal honesty, and brutal honesty means to be honest with your stakeholders and with your public when it hurts, when you have bad news. And to go public with bad news doesn't take a lot of effort. Don't worry, the media will pick up on it. It'll be all over the media. They'll do it for you. What it takes is courage. That's the hard part. That finding too, the second finding, that there, here and there are people who are very effective, who are working with the same disagreeing, cantankerous, conflicted public, get stuff implemented and get their respect. If you can get your staff to operate in this consent building way, I've got news for you. You all become implementation geniuses. We have testimonials from many, many public officials who say, Hans, I took your course 20 years ago. As I'm cleaning out my desk because I'm retiring here, I came across a certificate you all gave me when I went through that 3.5-day course on systematic consent building. And I want you to know that course changed my life. It changed my career. From there on forward, I became very effective in this agency. In fact, that came from an individual within the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency who was a regional director in one of the federal regions. And he said, I became so successful, I know people considered me an implementation genius because I could get along, I could get projects done that the agency hadn't been able to do. We have many, many testimonials of that sort. And I continue to be as amazed by them as I was when we stumbled across them. Because I know that public is crazy and cantankerous and can be so disagreeable, and they can be so user-friendly, so forgiving, so patient. You don't have to do it perfectly. Nobody does it perfectly. You do the best you can. And if they conclude, if the people out in the public conclude that you're doing the very best you can in addressing an important problem, and that you're being brutally honest, and that you really, really care about the people whom you're negatively affecting, and the institutions and organizations and companies, they're going to respect you. They're going to even admire you. You'll be an implementation genius.
Okay, thank you. Just to revisit a couple of the things Hans said before I open it up for any questions. What we've discovered, what we've researched, what we've now trained 40,000 plus professionals, policymakers on is how to develop the fiercest opponents' informed consent. And it's very different from consensus. Consensus is a very high level of agreement. That's where maybe there was some minor concessions needed to be made. But what we found is that when somebody calls us up and they say, you know, they're threatening violence or we can't get anything done, all this work we've been doing, these studies are being tabled indefinitely or just outright rejected. or the policymakers are getting recalled, what we find is that they usually have just dismissed the fiercest opponents because it feels like, and it's pretty natural to come to the conclusion that you're never going to win them over. And for some reason, there's this notion that you have to get their support. And if you think of informed consent, a lot like when you go to the doctor and the doctor has some terribly bitter medicine that she's telling you is going to save your life. Maybe it's chemotherapy. And there's going to be just terrible, terrible experiences and discomfort. You're not excited about that. You're not happy if that's the recommendation your doctor gives you. And that's why in the healthcare world, they use the term informed consent. It's the same thing. It's where you get the fiercest opponents who can never say, oh, yay, this is a great project, where they say, oh my gosh, this is going to be really bad news for me personally, or my company, or my organization, or my view of the world. And yet, I have a deep understanding, a much clearer understanding of your mission. And that's why Hans started out with mission, which is really the set of responsibilities we, the public, originally gave you as policymakers, as commissioners, as staff. You know, each has their own mini mission, and people often confuse it with the mission statement. But when people conclude, oh, you're being responsible to that mission we, the public, gave you, we have an expectation that you don't make compromises on those responsibilities to the squeaky wheel, unless it's us. Well, that doesn't play out fairly. And so how do you get anything done? You ask for their informed consent, and you don't ask for it, you develop it, you earn it. Where people say, I don't like it, just like the patient with the chemotherapy, as the bitter medicine, I don't like it, but now I have a deeper understanding of why you're making the recommendations you are. And they have to come to the conclusions that your team has, that this really is the right thing to do, given those responsibilities. And as Hans said, it all hangs on that the mission, those responsibilities are legitimate, that the organization's legitimate, that the problem they've identified or the opportunity they've identified as needing to be addressed is legitimate, that it's worthy of being a top priority. The way you're going about it is reasonable, and all those 16 steps. The public, particularly the opponents, have to come to that conclusion. It's not enough to tell them. They have to see it, you have to demonstrate it, you have to share your thinking in such a way that they have this aha. And that's how you develop informed consent. Too many public professionals and policymakers just ignore the fiercest opponents because they figure they can never win them over. They're saying never in my backyard, never on planet Earth. And yet we have problems that have to get solved. So those were just some finer points I wanted to highlight for you. I'm sorry, I'm sweating here. It's very hot for us in California, and I'm so glad the power didn't go out during that. What are your thoughts? How is this landing with you? What are you feeling, thinking? I know we've done a lot of talking here.
It makes sense.
Well, if you've ever had, I mean, just even in your personal life, maybe a neighbor has to do something that's going to be really unpleasant. Or in your, if you are at another level of government, maybe the state, if you find out they've been working on this for 6 months, 5 years, 10 years, and then they show up and say, you get your 3 minutes at the mic to give us your input. Most of us, that pushes some anti-government buttons. For most Americans and even Canadians, it pushes some buttons. Whereas if somebody comes to your door and says, I'm really afraid we're going to have some bad news for you, and yet I should be fired if I don't make, the right recommendation based on the technical analysis. That would be malfeasance. You're going to hear the bad news from me first, not from Facebook, not from a neighbor, not from some blogger, not from a journalist. And they say, wow, you went out of your way to knock on my door and, pardon the euphemism, like kick a sleeping dog and say, this is probably going to be bad news for you. I'm not sure what we're going to recommend yet, but I wouldn't be surprised. And if I were in your shoes, this would land as bad news for me. That's a demonstration of somebody who truly cares, who's not hiding behind, well, we don't know yet, it's uncertain. And that's completely natural that professionals do that, that they say, we don't want to say more than we know, and you can't, but to pretend you don't know some things and who it might be bad news for, it just undermines this this demonstration of how much you care. And then it turns into more of a lip service. So it sounds like Liana is exploring if that makes sense for her team to go through our training. We do a 3-day live virtual workshop like this. And then there's also some heavy duty online material that students who are really ready to apply this and become implementation geniuses that is available to them also. But my understanding is she felt like it would help to share, what might be happening. And it's not uncommon for the political figures to feel like you can't go out there with the bad news because your phone's the one that's going to ring off the hook. The public's going to call you. And when it comes to consent building, if it's done well, if it's done how we teach it, your phone won't be ringing with angry phone calls or outrage. If anything, people should stop and say, I didn't appreciate what a tough position you're in and how hard your staff is working. We've seen it flip overnight where people one day are a pariah in their community and the next day they say, please don't ever leave. Because they have an appreciation of these are hard, complex community problems you're trying to solve. If they were easy, we would just all get it done and agree. But we have different values, different perspectives, different needs, different priorities. And so how you weigh that is not cut and dry. Okay, I really will stop talking. Any questions, thoughts, comments, protests?
Jennifer, I have a question. So what I'm hearing, informed consent, it sounds like it's from the expert level or the staff level. Am I missing something? Is there a part where city council or planning commission member or as a group solicits that informed consent? Is it at all levels? Is it primarily at the staff or expert level?
It can be both. It's essential that the staff are doing it. But we have had policymakers go through our training because then it's much more comfortable for them to work with staff to focus on, okay, who really is going to be most likely hurt? How can we minimize those negative impacts as best we can? How do we demonstrate the things they need to know to come to the conclusion that we really are doing our best? and not addressing this problem wouldn't be the responsible thing to do.
So I imagine there'd be a similar conversation at the staff or expert level with the policymakers, so that we're all on the same page.
Yes, yes. And what's interesting is informed consent is not strictly between the staff and the public or the policymakers and the public. It's even internally. What's really weird is having grown up in this family business, my parents and I use it on each other where we say, I know you're going to hate this, but you know, I'm a teenager and here's the opportunity, and they would use it on me. And it's totally fine because it's not some underhanded gimmick thing. It's based on being brutally honest. So we see it where teams have to develop the informed consent of their boss or their subordinates. And what's really interesting is sometimes we have students return to their office. Like one gentleman sent us an email that his boss had sent him about why they were going to have to change their health plan or downsize their the staff. And he saw exactly how his boss had worked to develop the informed consent. And let me just say, there is also misinformed and uninformed consent. And those do terrible damage to an organization, a city's, a community's legitimacy and credibility. I used to live in the Boston area, and I went to a meeting where at Logan Airport, they were trying to put another runway. And a gentleman was there in protest, and he was like the grandson of somebody who had started this effort because of the misdeeds of that organization generations before. So you can create true enemies. And yet that's the beauty of informed consent is it doesn't matter where you are in the planning process. It doesn't matter what's happened in the past. You can develop the informed consent. I can't promise it. You know, I mean, it's the individual who has to decide to consent. What's incredible is we have not seen it fail when people follow what we teach. But again, it takes a lot of courage to knock on the door or reach out to somebody who is being abusive, has maybe personally threatened you. But we haven't seen it not change the relationship where then progress can be made. So I hope, does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. I keep forgetting that you can't see me. I can see you, but you can see the back of my head.
It's okay. I just figured it was one of the heads there on my screen.
Donna, does the county know about this training?
I don't believe so.
They need to know
I
about
think-
this.
Tim does. I've
Yes.
spoken with Tim about it.
He needs to know about this too.
You know, it's interesting. Having been in law enforcement for 35 years, I'm just looking at the steps. And when you're in a law enforcement situation, how fast you jump through these steps to get to a point of maybe arresting somebody. And have them go along with you without having to fight them or anything else. And I'm just sitting here reviewing these different steps and I'm thinking, okay, you do that, you do that, you do that, you do that. But you do all of that within a minute or two. And I can't think of how many times I have done that, not knowing that I was doing that.
But here's the interesting thing. And I used to be a firefighter, a professional firefighter, and same thing. You know, do you need to deal with this situation? Especially maybe it's instead of a fire situation, maybe it's a triage kind of situation. But yeah, police officers, law enforcement can be very good. The best are the ones where they get the person to say, absolutely, here, yep, arrest me. It's the right thing to do. And it diffuses what could have become a very dangerous situation.
Right.
Oh, darn it, what was I gonna say? Maybe it'll come to me.
You didn't say that, Dave. Arrest me. It's the right thing to do.
Yeah, it was before that. Oh, it's here's the strange thing. You know, we figure, hey, we're gonna hold. I talk to communities where they say, well, we're gonna hold 300 meetings and we're gonna have 20 open houses and sending out, 40 newsletters and 30 surveys. And, they genuinely mean to be reaching out and hearing from their public. They truly care. The crazy thing is the public, like Hans said, we don't give you credit for how much you did. You have to demonstrate how well you listened to us, particularly those of us that are going to be hurt. And that's in part because of our Jeffersonian democracy. It doesn't work perfectly, but it's designed to look out for the person that's going to be hurt or the underdog. That's why our movies are about that. That's why our novels are about that. It's the David and Goliath. And if you instead demonstrate that you're Goliath and you're going to steamroll over David, even your supporters will turn on you and say, oh, no, you don't. I don't necessarily agree with this opponent, but the way you're going about it, they don't feel good about, and maybe they'll even come to the opponent's rescue. So there's a lot at play here about our values as Americans, what we see as fair and unfair. So I hope that helps.
So, being born in Alabama, I think the saying you're going for is a hit dog will holler. Number two, do you make the distinction between misinformation, uninformed information, and disinformation? In other words, information that's introduced purposefully to influence the outcome.
Oh yeah, that's a ever-present question. As Hans said, our little mission as a team is to help the public, the government solve problems, to help you be effective at making your community better, because that's when government shows up. Government shows up when the private sector won't. There's nothing in it for them or they can't. And that's when we expect government to solve problems. That's why most of what government deals with are problems. Now, how they deal with it sometimes is a lot of regulation, and that creates other problems. But the disinformation, misinformation, being uninformed, what matters is that you do have to deal with that. But the big picture is whatever might impede you solving that original problem that falls under your mission, your set of responsibilities that we, the public, gave you. It all leads back to that. So even if it's somebody who would like your seat in office and they'll do anything it takes to get their name in the paper, how do you communicate with that person? It's not really, they're not uninformed necessarily, or disinformed or misinformed. They have a personal need. So how do you get them to make the trade-off that please don't hold this project or this effort to solve this problem hostage? And what we found is you can use informed consent or consent building to get them to conclude, okay, I'm not going to use this project as a pawn in my own agenda, and as we see it, that's not illegitimate for somebody to try to get their name in the paper. People need to pursue their own interests and needs. If you can get them to conclude that what you're doing is too important to do that, that's when you might save the project or the work you're doing, your team's doing.
So essentially roll with it.
Essentially, sorry, roll.
Roll with it.
Well, you have to work to create an informed public, an informed discourse. So if there is disinformation, somebody who's spreading disinformation, it's a symptom. It is not the problem itself. It's a symptom of a bigger problem. And until you get to the bigger problem, they might be compelled to keep spreading disinformation. So that's the kind, we do like a lot of diagnostic kind of work of what's really amiss in your relationship with particular interests. Some really mean, no, I don't want you in my backyard. And others, for others, there's something else that that's going on. So if somebody's spreading disinformation, to me, it's much more than the surface. They don't feel like you're probably very legitimate or whomever they're spreading disinformation about.
I will be interested to see if the staff, with the staff using some of the tools in this, because you talked about the David and Goliath, and the government coming in and steamrolling and whatever. Well, David, there's certain situations around here, David comes with studies and lawyers, and they have very much their agenda that is not going along with the plan. So I would like to see some of the tools in action to get informed consent from some of those people who I've seen push back consistently. So that's just, I'm not asking you to explain how you do that. I just want to, it'll be interesting to see what kind of tools the staff has as the experts going into that.
Yeah, it's none of it's gimmicks. There's no fancy tools. It's in that diagnostic work. That is where the best work is done to resolve those kind of issues. We've had retired hydrologists, biologists who were very capable of fighting. One was his whole profession was as a legal expert, and some engineers in Colorado had to propose something horrible for him. It was going to surround his homestead with essentially treated human waste. And he was an expert on fighting projects exactly like that. Was his whole career. And they didn't ask their boss for permission. They went after they had our training and knocked on his door and said, "Do you have a cup of coffee? We haven't even started a full day's work on this project, but we're pretty sure we're going to be really bad news for you." He was completely capable of stopping them, and he chose not to because they demonstrated such legitimacy. But it's, the person has to come to the conclusion. And so if they're not, then informed consent has not been earned or developed.
So Jennifer, basically what you're doing is you're telling us that Goliath has to change.
Yes,
You no longer can be Goliath.
you know what? We've been doing this so long. People think it's a new thing, but public professionals have been getting threats for the whole 40 plus years we've been in business, where they call us and say, these people they mean it. Anti-government is not a new phenomenon. It might be better known, but you're absolutely right. And I think that's a really hard thing for a lot of public professionals, public policymakers to hear, that you don't realize it, but you're probably pushing buttons that you had no intention of pushing. You're pretty sure you're demonstrating how credible, how legitimate your organization, your team, your commission is. But somehow That's not the message the public or some small segment of the public is coming away with. And it matters. It matters that those people haven't concluded that what you're doing is legitimate and fair.
And it's just like the view of law enforcement and how it had changed from 15 years ago to the last couple of years. And the attitudes of the law enforcement community and how some chose to address those issues that the public were bringing up. And it's interesting to see where those law enforcement entities that decided to address it and try to change and basically embrace what the public was saying and try to work with that, as opposed to other agencies that chose not to do that and be the Goliath, and where those problems really started exploding.
And sometimes the public is completely wrong. I'm not saying in that scenario necessarily, but sometimes they are. And what too often happens is people feel like, forget them. They're nuts. You can't communicate with them. They're irrational. And what we found is they're not irrational. They might be misinformed, disinformed. And so if you give up, then you're not going to develop their informed consent.
That's right.
Yeah. So you might have to say, I cannot understand how you came to this conclusion, and truly do all you can to understand them and how they're getting some message that you never intended to send, never thought you were sending. Yeah.
I think it's important to note, I think these are great principles, Jennifer. I appreciate them, and we've used them a lot in some very contentious environmental and natural resource issues over the years. But I think it's important to realize it goes beyond just making a decision on a problem. It has to be a way you operate day to day. If you're going to be credible with your public, you may get informed consent on the decision you make, but if you don't deliver, that respect goes right down the drain. So it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing approach to how you make those daily decisions. Don't accept a decision out there that you can't deliver on. And so
Absolutely.
as you go through these processes, you not only have to think about what's technically right, what can you get informed consent on from your key stakeholders, you have to be thinking about, is that an implementable decision at the end point? Because if you can't, it won't work. And it is touched on in here too. Don't think that once you've got a plan or you've made a decision that it's final. I've seen too many instances of that. People will spend months, if not years, working on a plan. They reach a decision. This is what we're going to do. They're tired. They're exhausted. They walk away from that process. And while everyone felt good about the plan, there was no follow through. So again, it's important to be taking the long vision here and keeping that approach going.
Exactly. It's a practice. This is what transparency really is when every day you are earning the public's trust, respect, legitimacy, credibility. If you know that whatever plan or project you're adopting can't actually come into fruition, that's dishonest. And so, and we've also had students who became an implementation genius, and then figured, hey, they trust me. Everything I do is credible, and they stop developing the informed consent. And we have watched one gentleman in Colorado again, the city manager there, he overnight lost trust where there was going to be a recall because they were demanding that he be fired. So they were going to recall. There was a start of a recall effort to recall the city councilors because they hadn't fired him. And he realized that he had been sitting on his laurels, not developing informed consent continuously. He figured he had it, he was good to go. And you're absolutely right. It's an ongoing practice that you have to, the more integrated it is throughout throughout your organization, the easier it is. But at the same time, it does take a lot of courage and a lot of mental work. It's not a lot of holding meetings. Meetings are a terrible listening device. Except here tonight.
Does feel like a work smarter, not harder thing. And it's definitely, I wrote down a couple times, do not ignore your fiercest opponent because it's counterintuitive, right? Like we want to hang out and go find people who agree with us. Like the last thing we want to do is make that call to someone who knows is going to be furious.
It's very uncomfortable.
But it sounds like it, and I've thought of a couple instances where, I much smaller scale have used the same thing, like, hey, I'm not going to be able to do what you want me to do, and this is why. And I was surprised that they went along with it, and they're like, okay, well, we understand. But I'd rather have a 5-minute uncomfortable conversation than like avoid, and then have it end up being like this explosion that doesn't go the right way. And it doesn't matter how well you've stacked your deck. If you've got one person who's not seeing it, doesn't matter how deep your bench is of people who do. Because the people who do don't necessarily show up to the meeting. Like they're like, oh, okay, great.
Well, and right. And that's who the opponents are, the ones who are going to show up. That's how most of us operate, unless we're fervently in favor of something. And so again, consensus is a very high level of agreement. It's wonderful if you can achieve it. That's when there's probably no one going to be hurt. Everybody goes along, says, oh yeah, this is obviously the right course of action. Consensus is neither usually in more complex problem solving issues. It's neither possible nor necessary. Whereas informed consent is both possible and absolutely necessary. Because sometimes people do ramrod a project through, they get it to adoption, they get it funded, they start getting it built, and the public comes to the conclusion that they were not informed or somebody was not considered, and they will literally take the project apart. You've probably heard of, there's a bridge somewhere where that was done not so long ago. So informed consent is again, both possible and necessary from our experience. Any other questions, thoughts? I really appreciate, sorry, go ahead.
It's interesting because whenever we present a project or an idea, we understand that a new project that requires participation, or anyway, we always like to throw out that this is outreach. We are providing an opportunity to present our idea and encourage the public to attend and see our idea and give them the opportunity to submit their thoughts. That's just putting out a bowl of cat food and waiting to see who shows up. But then when it comes down to actually voting, going through the process, now we've created this platform for those naysayers that were not reached out to directly to come and, as you pointed out in one of those slides, to derail a project because nobody talked to them. We gave an opportunity for them to come talk to us and got a positive results or had a chance at that time. But it's important, if you don't want an important project to derail at the 11th hour, to talk to that person who's going to have the most to say. That also means that the fabric of the way we do things has to change as well. The policymaker has to understand that certain things have been done beforehand, that staff, the experts have reached out, and then staff needs to be prepared to start making that shift as well.
Well, and as Hans said, sometimes you'll also have an interest who's playing games and will stay out because it is much easier to stop a process at the 11th hour. So consent building can help you deal with that scenario where somebody intentionally is staying out. They're playing a game. That person's not irrational, or that group is not irrational. They're trying to get their needs met. And there are ways to deal with that so that doesn't turn into an 11th hour, everything blows up kind of scenario.
We spent a fair amount of time here not so long ago on the Planning Commission looking at how we do public outreach. And it depends on the nature of the problem that you're trying to address. But, our concern was we don't have a lot of folks that show up and sit in the chairs. And how do you do that? And we've talked about, can we find community leaders we can talk to? Can we do living room conversations with folks? And not just staff, but planning commission members as well. So, I think part of the informed consent process really does go to the elected officials as well. You're out there in those communities. And maybe you're not talking about a specific outcome, but you should certainly be supporting that sort of informed consent process out there. So that they know that you care about what's going on.
Absolutely. I mean, I wish my policymakers would learn this process. Because sometimes I wonder, do they care? Are they even listening? Do I fill out their, 3-minute survey, or is it just going to fall on deaf ears? Yeah, I intended to go into the medical profession, and then I happened to observe what my parents, the effect they were having on the professionals, the policymakers, and the communities. And I saw just this tremendous healing effect where problems were getting solved instead of getting exacerbated and shelved and left to another generation. And the professionals were feeling fulfilled because they have all this knowledge and expertise and skill and experience. And the policymakers could feel like they were, it's a critical juncture, the policymakers between the subject matter experts and the public that they represent, that you represent, to be able to make that handoff and feel confident that no one has been missed, no serious issue has gone left ignored, that we really have done our very best. It doesn't mean it's perfect, but it does have a tremendous fulfilling experience, I guess, for those of us who have had that kind of effect on a community and able to get work from just, this would be a great solution or a great problem to address now instead of when our options are more limited. It's going to cost more, and our options, some options will be off the table. Any other thoughts or questions? I really appreciate your presence, your attention. I know it's a lot of talking. It's probably pretty warm up there in Oregon too. I'm sorry, Washington. Washington. See, it's so hot. I've got you on the wrong side of the river. Well, that's all I have to share. So.
Thank you very
Liana?
much, Jennifer.
Yeah.
I think this is kind of just the start. So staff will be going through the training, and we wanted to sort of let the elected and appointed officials know that sort of change is coming. And we've kind of, as Jeff kind of alluded to, as far as we've been trying to change our process for outreach and community engagement. And so I think this will be a good way to move that forward. Thank
I
you.
hope so. We would love to be of help. Yeah. All right. Well, thank
Thank you
you.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank
Yeah. Have a good evening.
Okay, thank you as well.
It's good stuff. Are we still doing something?
No, that was it.
Awesome.
So.
Bye.
Yeah.
Not to be rude. Love ya.